Lower Manhattan in early September still held on to the final warmth of summer. The mornings were mild, the breeze from the Hudson soft against buildings that had stood for decades. The streets buzzed with life in the usual New York rhythm, fast but familiar. Among the countless people who moved through these city blocks each day was Sneha Anne Philip, a 31-year-old physician who lived just a short walk from the southern tip of the island, where the twin towers of the World Trade Center cast their morning shadows. Sneha was in many ways typical of the young professionals who had made the city their home. She was intelligent, driven, and unapologetically independent. Her apartment, shared with her husband Ron Lieberman, sat in a modern residential building in Battery Park City. The neighborhood, though surrounded by the rush of Wall Street and the bustle of the financial district, had a calmness that made it feel removed from the rest of the city. There were parks, cafes, narrow sidewalks where neighbors passed one another with brief nods. It was a place that, for people like Sneha, offered just enough space to breathe between long shifts at the hospital. She had been born in India, raised in a close-knit, educated family who had immigrated to the United States. Her parents, both involved in professional fields, encouraged her and her siblings to pursue high ambitions. Sneha had taken that to heart early on. She attended Johns Hopkins University and later went to medical school in Chicago, where she met Ron. Their relationship had grown steadily, built on a shared sense of focus, long hours, and the understanding that medicine didn't allow for predictability. They married in 2000 and moved to New York not long after, both taking positions at hospitals in the city. Ron worked in the Bronx. Sneha had begun a residency in internal medicine at Cabrini Medical Center in Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like a young couple on a solid path. Comfortable apartments, supportive families, careers that demanded and returned respect. But the days were rarely simple. Residency meant long, erratic hours. It meant coming home late and leaving again early. It meant exhaustion that never fully lifted. And for Sneha, it had started to mean something else, too, tension at work. Her time at Cabrini hadn't gone the way she expected. In a profession built on discipline and structure, she had begun to feel that the demands being placed on her were not always fair. There had been disagreements, concerns about her performance, a formal disciplinary action. She denied the accusations and challenged the process, insisting that she was being unfairly judged. But the strain was there. It wasn't spoken about often at home, but it hung in the air all the same. Still, Sneha was not someone easily undone. She remained social, often spending time with her brother and cousin, both of whom lived in the city. She went out to dinner, stayed over at relatives' places, sometimes without letting Ron know in advance. It wasn't neglect. It was her way of maintaining freedom in a life that often felt rigid. She was known to enjoy nights out, especially on weekends. She liked good food, good conversation, and the comfort of people who knew her without explanation. But there was an undercurrent to her nights out, one that Ron didn't always understand. They had their disagreements like any couple, but nothing that, on the surface, would suggest anything was wrong. Sneha's relationship with her family remained close. She spoke to her mother regularly, and that familiarity hadn't changed since she left home. Her brother, a medical student, had become someone she confided in often. There was an ease between them, built over years of shared pressure and understanding. But she had also begun to keep more of her private world to herself. The city allowed that. It gave her the ability to walk away from a disagreement, to blend into a crowd, to spend a night in a friend's apartment if the mood at home felt too heavy. And when she needed to decompress, she'd often walk the streets near her apartment, blocks from where the towers stood, past the same coffee shop, past the same storefronts, just enough distance to feel like she could think. She was thoughtful but not withdrawn, private but never distant. She had opinions and she shared them freely. She wasn't someone who pretended, but she was also navigating something quietly, something not entirely visible to others. On the morning of September 10th, 2001, Sneha woke in her apartment as she normally did on a day off. There was no shift scheduled, no urgent need to check in at the hospital. Ron was home too, but their routines were separate. She had plans to run errands, maybe meet someone later in the day. Nothing exact, nothing fixed. The hours passed without urgency. She left the apartment sometime in the late morning. Surveillance footage would later confirm she was at Century 21, a department store just across from the World Trade Center. She moved through the aisles calmly. She looked at shoes, picked up a few items. She used her credit card to pay, lingerie, a dress, a pair of shoes. Her face on the security camera showed no alarm. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't meeting anyone visibly. She was alone. Back in the apartment, Ron waited. He assumed she'd gone to spend time with her cousin or brother. She had done that before, gone out for drinks, stayed over. It wasn't unusual. The city made those choices easy. The apartment didn't feel empty so much as quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't unfamiliar, especially during stretches of night shifts and early mornings. And so when night fell, and she still hadn't returned, Ron didn't panic. Not yet. Morning came quietly on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. The sun rose over the East River as it always did, casting warm, gold light across the rooftops and slowly filling the streets with movement. In Battery Park City, it felt like any other weekday morning. Early deliveries, footsteps echoing on pavement, the distant sound of horns from the West Side Highway. But in the Lieberman apartment, there was stillness. Ron woke to an empty bed. It wasn't a surprise at first. Sneha had stayed out overnight before. She had cousins nearby, close friends she sometimes visited, and when the mood called for it, she let herself drift from the rigid structure of home. Ron had learned to respect that about her. She didn't always explain where she was, but she always returned. Usually by morning, sometimes later. He made coffee, watched the clock. It was still early, too early to be concerned. The apartment was quiet, the morning calm. From their windows, the twin towers of the World Trade Center were visible, monoliths of steel and glass standing against the skyline. A landmark so familiar it barely drew attention anymore. By 8:30 a.m., Ron had started to wonder. He checked his phone. No calls, no messages. Still nothing unusual. But within minutes, the quietness of the day fractured. At 8:46 a.m., the sound came first, a sudden low roar. Then a vibration, not the kind you ignore, but the kind that pulls you to your feet before your mind has caught up. Out the window, the North Tower was no longer whole. A plane had struck it, sharp and violent. Smoke poured from the upper floors. For a long moment, it was impossible to make sense of what had happened. People stepped out of buildings, staring upward. Ron stood frozen at the window, unsure what he was seeing. It felt unreal. Then came the second impact. 9:03 a.m., South Tower. There was no mistaking what was happening now. It wasn't an accident. And with that realization came something deeper, heavier, and far more personal. The knowledge that Sneha hadn't come home. And now, even more than before, he didn't know where she was. The apartment, once familiar and calm, changed in feel almost instantly. Sirens echoed from every direction. Helicopters moved low across the sky. People ran in the streets. From the windows, Ron could see dust beginning to rise, smoke pushing down the avenues like a tide. Battery Park City, normally a place of peace at the edge of the island, became surrounded by uncertainty. The bridges and tunnels were sealed off. Subways ground to a halt. Communication networks collapsed. There was no way to get out, and there was no way to get answers. He tried to call Sneha. Tried again. Tried her cousin. Her brother. No one knew anything. The city was locking down. And whatever plans she may have had the night before, who she was with, where she might have gone, it had vanished with the shockwave that followed the attacks. For the rest of that morning, Ron did what many did. He watched. He waited. When the towers fell, the sound was like nothing he had ever heard. The building shook. The light outside darkened with ash and debris. The sky, once clear, turned the color of concrete. From their apartment windows, the world blurred. And still, Sneha hadn't come back. The phone lines were down. He couldn't leave. Every moment stretched out longer than the one before. He thought maybe she had stayed with someone overnight. Maybe she was caught in the shutdown. Maybe she was waiting, just like he was, unsure of when or how to move. Maybe she would call when the towers cleared. Maybe she was watching it all from another part of the city. He thought of her, saying she might go to windows on the world one day. He wondered if that day had been yesterday. As night came on, the city changed. The skyline, once marked by the towers, stood open and unfamiliar. Dust continued to settle across streets and buildings. People walked in silence. And in the apartment, Ron waited without sleep. Every hour that passed without a call felt heavier. He looked at the items she had left behind. Her bags. Her things. Her absence became louder in the stillness of the room. And the city was no longer just a place he lived. It had become something unknowable, something broken. And somewhere in it, somewhere beyond the reach of his calls, beyond the noise of the city that no longer worked, was Sneha. The days following September 11th blurred together, not only for those who lived near the epicenter of the destruction, but for the entire city. Time lost its rhythm. The familiar calendar of workdays and weekends dissolved into a kind of collective suspension. The air still smelled of smoke and pulverized concrete. Streets once crowded with traffic remained eerily empty. People moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding eye contact, their faces marked by a quiet, unsettled exhaustion. For Ron Lieberman, Sneha's husband, each hour brought a growing unease that no amount of rationalizing could quiet. On the evening of the 11th, he still held on to the belief, threadbare but present, that Sneha had simply stayed elsewhere for the night, that she was waiting out the chaos, that she, like thousands of others, might be somewhere in the city without phone service, cut off from the usual methods of communication, disoriented, but alive. But when she didn't return the following morning, and the next, that hope began to fade. Ron ventured out, though much of Manhattan below Canal Street was still restricted. There were police blockades, checkpoints, detours. Even residents with proof of address were sometimes turned back. The apartment building itself remained largely sealed, as the surrounding area was being treated like a disaster zone. But he went anyway. He visited hospitals. He asked for her name. He described her face. He brought photos. At each location, the response was the same, calm, apologetic, and empty. No one had seen her. No one had admitted her. No one had her name. The lists of the dead were still being compiled. Most names had not yet surfaced. Many of those lost in the towers remained unaccounted for, entombed beneath rubble. For days, families lined the sidewalks with posters, holding up photographs of loved ones, fathers, sisters, sons, fiancés. Sneha's photo joined them. Ron brought it with him everywhere. In some places, he taped it to lamp posts. In others, he handed it to volunteers, asking for help. The words "last seen on September 10th" were circled in red. That detail alone made her case different. She hadn't vanished during the attacks. She had vanished the day before. The last confirmed sighting of Sneha remained unchanged. Department store surveillance footage showing her calmly purchasing items at Century 21, just across the street from the World Trade Center. She appeared composed, deliberate in her choices. Her credit card confirmed the purchases. After that, the trail went dark. Ron told investigators she had spoken to her mother that afternoon, a routine conversation. She had mentioned a few errands, possibly dinner plans. Nothing alarming. And yet, no one could confirm seeing her after that point. Not the front desk attendant at their apartment. Not her brother or cousin. Not any friend or family member. Her phone remained unanswered. Her bank account dormant. Her Metro card showed no activity. Her email untouched. What made the search harder was the collapse of systems that would have normally helped track a missing person. Transportation networks were frozen. Surveillance systems in and around Lower Manhattan had been knocked out or deprioritized. Police departments were overwhelmed, not just by the immediate crisis of the attack, but by the unprecedented volume of missing persons reports. Thousands flooded in. Many were duplicates. Some were hopeful errors. But each one represented a life, and a family desperate to find them. Sneha's report was one among many, but it stood apart. She had not been scheduled to be near the towers on the morning of September 11th. She had no reason to be at the site. She wasn't working that day. Her shift had been canceled. Her apartment was a short walk from ground zero, but that alone didn't explain her disappearance. And yet, the possibility that she had gone toward the towers, perhaps in an attempt to help, could not be dismissed. She was a doctor, trained for emergency, trained to move toward, not away from, people in need. Ron clung to this theory. It was the only one that explained both her disappearance and her silence. He imagined her running into the chaos, trying to assist, possibly caught in the collapse. It was a narrative rooted in who she was: capable, brave, compassionate. But the timeline made it difficult to prove, and investigators, as the days went on, began to consider other possibilities. Ron faced questions he hadn't prepared for. Where had Sneha planned to spend the night of the 10th? Had she spoken of meeting anyone? Had she expressed fear or frustration in the days prior? Had they argued? Had there been any signs that she might have wanted to leave, not just the apartment, but the life they shared? He answered everything as plainly as he could. They had a typical relationship, not without tension, but grounded in love. She had been under stress, yes. Her job had become difficult. She was appealing disciplinary actions at work. She had taken time off. But she wasn't someone who ran. She had always been independent, always held her own. This wasn't her pulling away. This wasn't her choosing to disappear. Still, police quietly filed her as missing under unusual circumstances. And quietly, too, they began to look into alternate explanations. Not because of malice, but because her name didn't fit cleanly into the lists of 9/11 victims. She hadn't been scheduled to be at the towers. No witness placed her there. No debris, no remnants, no trace had emerged from the rubble that could confirm her presence. And so her case, even as Ron and her family searched with growing desperation, began to drift into a different kind of silence. The kind that settles in when a person disappears not into fire or dust, but into doubt. In the early days of a missing persons case, what's known tends to shrink under the weight of what's unclear. For Sneha Anne Philip, that shift happened slowly. At first, her name was spoken alongside thousands of others. But as time moved on and no confirmation of her presence at Ground Zero emerged, something subtle began to change in how her case was treated. There was no declaration, no specific moment, just a gradual, quiet redirection, away from the assumption of tragedy and toward the possibility of something else. Ron continued to hope that she had been there, that she had seen the burning towers and instinctively rushed toward them, perhaps overwhelmed by smoke or caught in the collapse. But there was no witness to place her at the scene. No trace of her was ever found in the rubble. And when the days turned to weeks, the questions that had once been put aside began to re-enter the investigation. The police no longer treated her case strictly as a 9/11 disappearance. Instead, they began looking more closely at her life before that morning. Sneha had not kept secrets, but she had moved with independence that occasionally left gaps in others' understanding of her routine. She was known to leave the apartment without notice, especially on days off, sometimes spending the night with her cousin or her brother. She had friends outside of work, places she liked to go alone. Her time was her own, and she made decisions without consulting anyone. It was part of what made her who she was: self-reliant, direct, comfortable in her solitude when she needed it. But those habits, viewed through the lens of a missing persons investigation, were reinterpreted. The police requested more details about her last few months. They learned that her position at Cabrini Medical Center had become strained. There had been issues, not just with punctuality, but with conduct. She had been suspended, and though she maintained that the accusations were false, the tension remained. She had filed a complaint herself, accusing one of her superiors of harassment. The situation was complicated, emotionally charged, and still unresolved at the time of her disappearance. In the midst of that turmoil, Sneha had taken time off. Ron confirmed that she was not working during the week of the attacks, that she had planned to relax, maybe reset. But even that fact was met with quiet skepticism, because with time off came unstructured hours, and unstructured hours left room for speculation. The police began reviewing her financial records. Her credit card history showed several purchases in the days leading up to September 10th. Most were ordinary: clothing, toiletries, household items. But one purchase stood out, made late in the afternoon at Century 21, the last confirmed sighting of her. After that, there was nothing. No ATM activity, no transit card use, no phone calls or messages. Her digital footprint went cold. Investigators began asking questions that no one wanted to entertain. Had she met someone? Was she planning to go somewhere? Had she been carrying more than just the stress of work? Was she trying to start over? Or was she in danger from someone she hadn't spoken about? Ron and Sneha's family rejected these ideas. They insisted that her absence was not a choice, that she had no reason to run, no reason to hide, that if anything had weighed heavily on her, she would have said so. She had spoken to her mother the afternoon of September 10th. There had been no hint of distress, no change in her tone. She had seemed tired, but nothing more. But the police weren't convinced, and slowly the tone shifted further. Investigators began reviewing the building's surveillance footage. The system hadn't captured her re-entering the apartment after her trip to the store. That fact was used as evidence that she may not have come back at all. But Ron pushed back. The security system had blind spots. The cameras didn't cover every entrance. The timestamps were often inaccurate. He argued that it proved nothing, yet it became a central detail in the revised narrative. No confirmed return. No confirmed exit on the 11th. No evidence that she had been near the towers at all. Ron continued to insist that the absence of evidence did not mean absence of presence. That the chaos of that day had erased many things. People had been vaporized, records destroyed. That just because her name wasn't on a list didn't mean she hadn't been there. But the police had begun to frame her disappearance differently. They listed her as a missing person, not a 9/11 victim. They noted that her last known activities were personal, not professional. They suggested, without accusing, that there may have been something more to the story. The press, once focused on the broader tragedy, took note. Articles began to appear that questioned the timeline, that pointed to her job troubles, that speculated about her behavior. What had once been presented as a tragedy now took on the shape of a mystery. And Sneha, who had been seen as a possible hero, was now portrayed in some corners as unstable, as someone possibly running from something. Her family, especially her parents, pushed back against these portrayals. They called them cruel, misleading, unfair. Sneha had been a dedicated doctor, a loyal daughter, and a compassionate person. She had helped her friends through depression, had cared for patients in need, had shown up for others in ways few ever knew. Whatever difficulties she faced, they said they did not define her. But the narrative had begun to shift in a way that could not be fully undone. She was no longer just one of the missing. She had become the center of a question no one could answer. And the silence around her remained. As the weeks slipped into months, the absence of Sneha and Philip grew heavier. Not just in her apartment, or in the eyes of her husband, or in the cold offices of investigators and clerks, but in the space where certainty should have lived. Her name sat in an in-between place, one foot in the overwhelming loss of 9/11, the other in the quiet category of those who simply vanished. And in that space, her husband Ron found himself in a different kind of fight. No longer just a search for his wife, but a search for the truth he believed was being slowly erased. It began with the language. When official records listed Sneha as missing under unknown circumstances, Ron pushed back. He said it was wrong, not only inaccurate, but insulting. It implied that her disappearance might have been her choice, that perhaps she had wanted to be lost, that her silence was not the result of tragedy, but of decision. And he could not accept that. He had lived through the day the towers fell. He had waited by the phone, watching smoke fill the sky outside their windows. He had walked the streets in the days after, carrying her photograph, asking nurses and volunteers and police officers if they'd seen her face. He had posted flyers. He had called every hospital in the 5 boroughs. And not once had he believed she had left him. Not once had he believed she had run. He knew her. Knew how she thought, how she moved, how she fought when things got difficult. And if something had overwhelmed her, if she had truly been struggling, he believed she would have told someone. She would not have disappeared into the folds of a tragedy without a reason. But proving presence is harder than proving absence, especially in the aftermath of something as devastating as the September 11th attacks. Thousands of people had died, many of them without a trace. Some had never been identified. The fires had burned so hot and the collapse so absolute that even the idea of finding a body was, in many cases, an impossibility. But in most cases, there was a reason for the person to have been there: a job, an appointment, a known schedule. Sneha had none of those. She hadn't worked that day. She had no meeting scheduled, no confirmed destination. And so, without that tether, her presence was treated as unlikely, unless it could be proven. Ron and Sneha's family began to push back in every way they could. They hired attorneys. They spoke to city officials. They began the long, complicated process of trying to have Sneha declared a victim of the attacks, not for the purposes of publicity, but because they believed it to be true. They believed she had gone toward the towers that morning, possibly to help. She was a physician. That instinct had been a part of her for as long as they'd known her. If she had seen what was happening, if she had felt, even for a moment, that she could assist, then there was no doubt in their minds that she would have gone. But again, the evidence was thin. There was no one who had seen her. No one who remembered her entering the area. No personal belongings recovered. No eyewitness. Only her proximity. Only her nature. And for the city to make an official declaration, more was required. In 2002, nearly a year after her disappearance, Ron submitted a formal request to have Sneha's name included among the victims of the World Trade Center attacks. The request was denied. The explanation was procedural. There was not enough evidence to prove she had died as a result of the attacks. Her last confirmed sighting was the afternoon before. No data placed her at ground zero. And because she had been missing before the towers fell, her case remained separate. Ron appealed. He submitted statements from family and friends. He described her character, her habits, her compassion. He explained that she would not have left without saying something. That the idea of her abandoning her life, her home, her marriage, was unthinkable. That while she had faced pressures at work, she had been fighting through them, not running from them. Still, the city declined, and the implication that perhaps she had chosen to disappear remained. Ron was devastated, not only because he felt it betrayed her memory, but because it turned her into something she was not. A question mark, a mystery, and she had never been that. He kept pushing. Over the next 2 years, he filed more documents. He collected testimonials. He brought the case to court, arguing that all the circumstantial evidence pointed to one conclusion: that Sneha had been caught in the attacks. That the lack of physical evidence was no different than in many other cases. That her location, her last known activities, and her character supported the conclusion that she had gone toward the towers, and that she had perished there. In 2004, a judge agreed. Sneha Anne Philip was declared a victim of the attacks on the World Trade Center. Her name was added to the official list. Her death certificate was amended, and for a moment Ron felt something close to peace. Not because he had found all the answers, but because the woman he loved had been acknowledged. Her absence was not a disappearance. It was a loss. But even then, not everyone accepted the ruling. Some critics argued that the judge's decision had been based on emotion more than evidence. Others pointed to the ongoing inconsistencies in her story, her professional issues, her patterns of behavior, the gaps in her timeline. They suggested the possibility that she had chosen to vanish, that perhaps she had started a new life somewhere, or that she had met with an unrelated tragedy. None of that mattered to Ron, because for him, the core truth remained unchanged. He had known her, and the silence she left behind was not voluntary. In the years that followed the official ruling, Sneha Anne Philip's name became a fixture, not only in court documents and government records, but in the permanent stone markers etched with the names of those lost on September 11th. Her inclusion on the memorial list came not with ceremony, but with the quiet weight of acknowledgement. Her name was placed alongside thousands of others, names spoken in grief, remembered in silence and carved into history. For her family, it was a form of recognition they had fought to secure. But for the public, her story remained distinct, still wrapped in uncertainty, still caught between what was known and what was left behind. The inclusion had not resolved the questions. It had not erased the complexities of her final days. It had not silenced the doubts of those who saw her case as something different. Instead, it made her story more visible. And with that visibility came renewed interest, renewed scrutiny, and the return of old theories that never quite settled. Publications, documentarians, and amateur investigators revisited the timeline. They studied the surveillance footage. They dissected her credit card records. They interviewed family and former colleagues. And once again, the same debate unfolded. Had Sneha been at the towers, swept into the ash and silence of that morning, or had she vanished in the hours before, by choice or by circumstance? For Ron, the answer remained unchanged. But for others, the gray space persisted. Much of the renewed attention centered not on the attack itself, but on the days leading up to it. Investigators had learned, during the original inquiry, that Sneha had been under suspension from her residency at Cabrini Medical Center. The suspension stemmed from an incident involving accusations of unprofessional behavior. Sneha had disputed those accusations, formally filing a complaint of her own. She had alleged that she had been sexually harassed by a colleague and that her workplace had retaliated against her. The situation was unresolved at the time she went missing. Some saw this as a crucial detail. They believed the suspension had weighed heavily on her in the weeks before her disappearance, that it may have led to increased drinking, to late nights, to instability in her daily rhythm. They pointed to reports that she had occasionally spent nights away from the apartment, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. They noted a growing distance between her and her workplace, and the fact that she was not scheduled to work on September 11th, nor was she required to be anywhere specific that morning. But others, especially those closest to her, viewed these details differently. They saw a woman trying to defend herself against a system that had mistreated her. They saw strength, not disorder. And they rejected the idea that her independence and occasional absence from home were signs of anything more than someone trying to navigate a difficult chapter of life in her own way. The media often struggled with how to present her. Some stories treated her sympathetically, framing her as a victim twice over, once of a flawed system and once of an unfathomable national tragedy. Others veered into something colder, describing her in clinical terms, focusing on the inconsistencies in her timeline, her unresolved professional conflict, the absence of confirmed evidence at ground zero. Ron read it all. He saw her name in headlines, read the theories, watched as her life was debated by people who had never met her. And he felt, with each passing year, that the person she truly was had begun to disappear from view. In place of her voice, there were arguments. In place of her presence, there was speculation. He returned, more than once, to the memorial. He stood before her name, carved into bronze. He traced it with his fingers. Around him, other families did the same. And in those moments, the noise quieted. The stories fell away. And what remained was the loss. Uncomplicated, unexplained, undeniable. Some investigators, years after the case was closed, revisited their notes. Not to reopen anything, but to reflect on what had stayed with them. A few admitted the truth that had always lingered beneath the surface. That missing person cases, when framed by extraordinary events, tend to resist closure, especially when the person at the center of them carried their own silence. In the absence of a witness, a recovered item, a confirmed sighting, certainty becomes a fragile thing. And yet, for those who knew Sneha, it was not uncertainty they carried. It was grief. The apartment in Battery Park City was eventually cleared out. Her clothes packed away, her books placed in boxes. The shoes she had purchased on her final day remained in the bag, never worn. Ron kept them, though he rarely looked at them. For him, they were not just belongings. They were part of a moment, the last moment when her life intersected with the visible world. In the years that followed, he moved on slowly. He returned to his medical work. He continued living in New York. But a part of him remained fixed in that window of time. the space between her last known movement and the day the world changed forever. He would never stop believing that Sneha had died trying to help. He didn't need a witness to believe that. He knew her, and that was enough. September 11th began with a sky so clear it seemed artificial. That morning, before the smoke, before the chaos, before the sirens blurred into one another and the skyline was reshaped forever, the day had unfolded like any other in late summer. Pedestrians sipped coffee on their way to the subway. Businessmen checked their watches. Children boarded school buses. And at 8:46 a.m., everything changed. The North Tower was hit first. The sound carried across blocks, low and violent. Windows trembled. People froze mid-step, heads tilted to the sky. Black smoke poured from the gash high above. Then, 17 minutes later, the second plane tore through the South Tower, and the momentary illusion of accident collapsed into something far more terrifying. In Battery Park City, where Sneha and Ron lived, the view of the towers had always been uninterrupted. On clear mornings, they stood like monuments. That day, they became something else, burning structures that groaned as they carried the weight of thousands of lives. From the apartment, Ron watched as the flames spread. He watched as debris fell, as people ran below, as sirens split the air into thin, anxious strands. But nowhere in all that movement was Sneha. She had not come home the night before. She had not answered her phone. She had not been seen. He told himself she might be somewhere safe, that maybe she was trying to get back, that she was stranded on the other side of a blockade, just out of reach. But even as he tried to believe this, he also knew the truth. She was close. She had been shopping just blocks from the towers. Her last confirmed steps had been within sight of them. If she had stayed in the area, if she had walked toward the towers when the attacks began, she would have had minutes, only minutes, to react. The South Tower collapsed first, at 9:59 a.m. Then, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. With each collapse, the city lost shape. Clouds of dust roared through the streets like floodwater, blanketing everything in gray. It was hard to breathe, to see, to know where one was in relation to anything else. Buildings disappeared. Familiar landmarks vanished in haze. And beneath it all, silent now, were thousands of voices that would never be heard again. If Sneha had been anywhere near that radius, there was little chance she would have survived. The city's emergency systems were overwhelmed, ambulances rerouted, firefighters lost inside the wreckage. Even hospitals struggled to manage the chaos. Not because of an influx of the injured, but because there were so few survivors to treat. For those who lived nearby, the hours after the collapse passed in a kind of muted disbelief. Phones were dead, power flickered, roads were shut, bridges closed. People walked slowly, coated in dust, some in silence, others crying without sound. The air stung the eyes, burned the lungs. It tasted like metal and stone. And through it all, Ron waited. He tried to call, again and again. He left messages, checked voicemail, walked the perimeter of the police barriers, showing her photograph to whoever would pause long enough to look. Every step he took in the ash-covered streets felt heavier than the last. By nightfall, it was clear she was not coming home. There were stories that began to circulate in the following days, of doctors who had raced to the towers with medical bags, of passers-by who had helped strangers into shelters, of nurses who had set up makeshift triage centers outside closed clinics. Some had been verified, others were only rumors. The line between them grew thinner with time. It became almost impossible to separate truth from hearsay. And for Sneha, that ambiguity held particular weight. She was a doctor, trained to act under pressure, trained to run toward pain. The idea that she might have seen the smoke, the bodies falling, the chaos in the streets, and walked away from it, felt impossible to those who knew her. If she had been anywhere near the scene, it was believed she would have responded. Not out of obligation, but instinct. There was no footage, no witness. But those who knew her said she wouldn't have needed a reason to help. She simply would have. In the official investigation, these beliefs were noted, but remained unconfirmed. Emergency response records had no mention of her. No ambulance logs listed her name. No hospital intake matched her description, but that meant little in the aftermath. There had been no protocol that day, no normal record keeping. People had run without checking names. Many had died without identification, and the wreckage had consumed bodies without distinction. Ron believed she had died helping. Her family believed it. Her friends, too. And over time, even as the theories continued, that belief became the core of her story. Not because it could be proven beyond all doubt, but because it aligned with the person she had always been. She had spent her life offering care, and perhaps in the final moments of her life, she had done the same. In the days after September 11th, the world watched Lower Manhattan as if through a pane of silence. The dust didn't settle quickly. For weeks, the smell of burnt steel and paper lingered in the air. Downtown streets remained barricaded. The skyline, suddenly incomplete, looked unfamiliar to longtime residents. Inside that stillness, grief took on 1,000 shapes, some loud, some quiet, all altered by the magnitude of what had happened. The city moved forward as best it could. Posters were stapled to every light pole. Flyers taped to subway walls flapped in the autumn wind. Families clung to hope for missing sons, daughters, spouses. Names were read on street corners by people whose voices cracked under the weight of absence. Sneha Anne Philip's name was among them, but from the beginning, hers was a different kind of loss. The timing of her disappearance, the day before the towers fell, made her case difficult to categorize. Her last known actions placed her near the World Trade Center, but not inside. Her apartment was just blocks away. She had not been scheduled to work. No one could place her after the afternoon of September 10th. Her proximity to the attacks blurred the narrative. Her silence was interpreted in different ways, depending on who was listening. And as the immediate chaos gave way to methodical accounting, her case became more complicated. There was a structure to grief in those early weeks, defined by the systems that took shape around the catastrophe. The missing were counted, their names recorded, evidence was collected, receipts, security footage, badge swipes, phone logs. Each victim's presence had to be documented to be officially acknowledged. In most cases, it was a formality. In some, it was impossible. And in Sneha's, it was unclear. Ron, still holding on to the conviction that his wife had died trying to help, found himself at odds with the way her case was being described. Police reports grew more clinical. Investigative notes focused on inconsistencies. Instead of recognizing her as a potential first responder or bystander victim, they began to describe her as a person who had been missing before the attack. Some journalists picked up the story. Early articles framed Sneha's case sympathetically. Another tragedy in a city already overwhelmed with grief. A doctor, a newlywed, a woman who had vanished in the shadow of the towers. But as weeks turned into months, the tone shifted. Stories began to emphasize her suspension from work, her disagreements with her superiors, her nights away from home, her complicated relationship with time and place. She was no longer simply a victim of 9/11. She had become, in the eyes of some, a question mark. And in that shift, something deeper was lost. Ron saw it happen. He watched as the media reduced her to a list of facts that didn't tell the full story. He knew her better than that. He knew the person who fought for her patients, who challenged unfair systems, who stood by her principles even when they came at a cost. He knew how fiercely she loved her family, how she leaned into her independence not to distance herself from others, but to protect the parts of her that needed space to breathe. To see her painted as unstable, directionless, or reckless felt not only wrong, it felt cruel. And yet, in the void where answers should have lived, speculation grew. Some questioned whether she had chosen to disappear. Others speculated that she had died under unrelated circumstances, perhaps during an evening out, perhaps meeting someone she didn't know well. The police never ruled out foul play, but they also never found any evidence of it. There were no bank withdrawals, no activity on her phone or email after the 10th, no travel records, no sightings that held up under scrutiny, just stillness, a flat line. And that lack of movement became, in its own way, a kind of evidence. Still, the city declined to place her name on the official victim list. It wasn't personal, they said. It was procedural. Ron disagreed. Her story had not changed. Only the willingness to believe it had. Years later, when the memorial at Ground Zero was being planned, Ron submitted her name. He submitted statements from her family, documents, personal letters. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he knew where she had been. He knew her last steps. He knew the neighborhood, the apartment, the way she thought. He knew her, and he believed that in the face of horror, she had done what she always did. She moved toward it, not because she had to, because she would have, because that's who she was. It took years for Sneha Anne Philip's case to move from the realm of unanswered questions to the scrutiny of the courtroom. The absence of a clear, documented link between her disappearance and the September 11th attacks had left her family in limbo. Unlike many others who were presumed lost that day, Sneha's case was always different. Her last known movements happening not during the tragedy, but the evening before. That single detail had placed her story on a separate track from the very beginning. But Ron Lieberman refused to let her memory fall into that gap. After the dust of Ground Zero had settled, after the memorials had begun, after other families received death certificates and closure, he was still fighting. Not for money, not for attention, but for something less tangible, yet equally vital. Recognition, understanding, the confirmation that Sneha's final moments had not simply slipped through the cracks of a chaotic morning, but mattered just as deeply as any of the thousands of other lives lost. The path to that recognition, though, was not straight. After filing the initial paperwork to have Sneha declared a victim of the World Trade Center attacks, Ron received word that the New York City Medical Examiner's Office had denied the petition. The rationale was simple and devastating. There was insufficient evidence to confirm that Sneha had died as a direct result of the terrorist attack. Her last confirmed activity was a shopping trip the afternoon before. No witness had seen her near the towers the next morning. There was no forensic trace of her in the wreckage. By procedural standards, she did not meet the criteria. That decision reopened every wound. To Ron, it was not just a technicality. It was a dismissal of the truth he had carried for years. He knew her. He knew how she responded to chaos, to emergency. He knew that if she had seen the towers burning, she would not have turned away. Even if her movements couldn't be plotted by timestamp or receipt, even if no camera captured her last steps, he believed with all the certainty grief allows that she had gone toward the towers, and that she had died there. He filed an appeal. The legal battle that followed was difficult, personal, and unlike any other that came out of 9/11. Because while most families were focused on grieving, on rebuilding, on surviving the weight of loss, Ron was being asked to defend Sneha's character, to revisit the most painful parts of her final months, to confront the doubts cast by others, and to answer questions no one should have to answer when seeking acknowledgement for the death of a loved one. It became a case not just about time and place, but about identity. The court heard arguments from both sides. On one side, Ron and his legal team presented the context of her life. Her apartment located just a few hundred yards from the World Trade Center. Her last confirmed whereabouts, shopping across the street from the site. Her profession as a physician. Her compassion. Her history of responding to others in distress. On the other, the city presented the absence of direct evidence. The lack of confirmed sightings. The fact that she had not been scheduled to work. The fact that she had not called or checked in with anyone after the 10th. They raised, too, the difficulties she had been facing. Her professional suspension, her strained schedule, her reported emotional state. They didn't accuse her of fleeing, but they implied it. Quietly, formally, through documents and filings and footnotes. It became, in the cold logic of legal language, a question of probabilities. What was more likely? That Sneha, after years of personal and professional stress, had chosen to disappear, either deliberately or by falling into circumstances unrelated to the attacks, or that she had seen the chaos, reacted as a doctor would, and walked into a moment of history from which she never returned? For those who loved her, the answer was obvious. But courts ask for more than belief. They ask for proof. In early 2004, a state appellate court sided with the city. The ruling stated that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Sneha had died in the World Trade Center attack. The panel acknowledged the tragedy of her disappearance, but maintained that her case did not meet the legal standard required. She would remain classified as a missing person. Her death would not be officially attributed to the events of September 11th. Ron was devastated. Again, the ruling felt like a second disappearance, this one from memory. He appealed once more. And in January 2008, the New York State Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, overturned the previous decision. The ruling was narrow in legal terms, but deeply significant in personal ones. The court concluded that, based on the facts available, the most reasonable explanation for Sneha's disappearance was that she had died as a result of the attack on the World Trade Center. They accepted that her proximity, her known movements, and the chaos of that morning made other explanations less likely. While they acknowledged the lack of direct evidence, they determined that in the absence of any other plausible scenario, it was appropriate to recognize her death as connected to the attacks. Sneha Anne Philip was officially declared a victim of 9/11. For Ron, the ruling brought a kind of closure, but not the end of mourning. He had not won back his wife. He had not uncovered the missing hours, but he had restored her place in the public record. He had secured her name on the memorial. He had ensured that she would not be forgotten in the footnotes. Her story would no longer be marked with an asterisk or left off the list. And while that did not undo the loss, it gave it a shape others could see. It gave it a name among names. By the time Sneha Anne Philip's name was etched into the bronze panels at the National September 11th Memorial, nearly 7 years had passed since the morning she vanished. The ruling that finally placed her there had come quietly, after legal arguments and appeals, after seasons of waiting. Her name joined thousands of others, victims who were seen, confirmed, counted. But hers still stood apart, not because it didn't belong, but because it had taken so long to be believed. For most, the names on that memorial evoke memories of a single day. A flight number, a workplace, a time of impact. But Sneha's name carried more shadow than outline. Her place in the story came without a clear beginning or end. It came with questions that never quite closed. To those who passed her name while tracing the others, she might appear to be another victim, quiet in her legacy. But to those who knew her, or had read about her, or had followed her story, hers was the name they paused over just a little longer, because her story was different, and yet it was still part of the same loss. Over time, Sneha's story began to appear in books and documentaries. Some treated it gently, carefully preserving her memory as that of a woman lost too soon, in the wrong place, under impossible circumstances. Others took a different tone, probing, speculative, layering theories that complicated what her family had fought so hard to secure. They spoke of her troubles at work, her shifts in behavior, her moments of absence. They hinted at possibilities without confirming anything, and in doing so, they reshaped her legacy for the public, not as a doctor who may have rushed to help, but as a mystery to be solved. For Ron and her family, these portrayals stung. They turned a deeply personal grief into something strangers could dissect. Her silence was interpreted, her independence questioned. Her last steps became a series of theories rather than the memories of a person. Each time a journalist revisited her timeline, it brought the same ache, the same need to say again she mattered, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. She was not perfect. No one is. She had struggles. She had days when the weight of her work and her own expectations overwhelmed her. She had moments where she stepped away from the people closest to her, not to hurt them, but to breathe. She was in every way human, and like so many others, she was doing her best to hold her life together while quietly navigating pain. In that way, her story speaks to more than just the events of 9/11. It speaks to how easily someone can slip from certainty, to how quickly assumptions take root when a person disappears without a clear narrative, to how women especially are often remembered not as they were, but as symbols or puzzles or warnings. Sneha was none of those things. She was a physician, a sister, a daughter, a wife. She was kind, fierce, curious, and deeply private. And she was loved. In the years that followed, the city continued to rebuild around Ground Zero. The footprint of the towers became pools of still water. Tourists came, hushed by the silence. Families left flowers. School groups paused beside names they didn't recognize. And somewhere among those thousands of names was the one that had taken the longest to be written down. Sneha's name, unadorned, unexplained, but no longer missing. Long after the hearings ended, after the court ruling was handed down and her name carved into bronze, Sneha Anne Philip's absence remained a living thing for those who had known her best. Not the version of her picked apart in police reports, not the outline sketched by journalists or speculated over on television. The real Sneha, the one they remembered not as a mystery, but as a woman they had laughed with, fought with, celebrated, worried about, and loved. The absence she left behind didn't feel like a gap to be filled or a question to be answered. It was a presence in their lives, a quiet echo, a missing voice in rooms that still held her shape. Ron never truly stopped talking about her. Not always aloud, not always to others, but in the quiet rituals of daily life. The ones that had once belonged to two people and now belonged only to one. Their apartment, once shared, had long since been cleared of the signs of her day-to-day life. Her coats, her notebooks, the coffee mug she'd favored, the small lamp beside her side of the bed, all gone. And yet, he still heard her voice in the corners of his memory. He still reached, sometimes unconsciously, to text her something he'd seen in passing. The reflex hadn't left him. In conversations, her name came naturally, not always in grief, but in familiarity. He would recall a movie she'd loved, a book she'd sworn she'd finish, but never did. When certain songs played in grocery stores or elevators, he would remember the way she used to hum along to the ones she recognized, slightly off-key, always unconcerned. It was the small, consistent details that survived. The way she always left her keys in the same dish, the way she folded laundry while standing, never sitting, the way she could hold 5 competing thoughts in her mind at once and still ask if he'd eaten. Her absence was not a vanishing. It was a quiet transformation of space. Everything that had once been shared had adjusted its shape around her. Her family, too, carried her forward, not in large gestures, but in the small acts of remembering that continue long after public interest fades. Her parents spoke of her when they gathered with relatives. They kept her photos near, not framed like a memorial, but woven into the daily fabric of their lives. Her brother, who had once been a close confidant, went on to finish his studies. When he spoke of her, he did so with warmth, sometimes sadness, but rarely confusion. Because for the people who loved her, Sneha was never a mystery. She had been a full person, not a perfect one, but a real one. They remembered her for the things others forgot, her laughter, which was unfiltered and sometimes loud, her sarcasm, dry and precise, her anger, when she felt something was unjust, her deep kindness, which revealed itself in quiet ways, in the way she'd sit with a friend who was spiraling, or bring food to someone who hadn't asked, or spend hours on the phone just to let someone talk. Those weren't dramatic traits. They weren't headlines. But they were her. When the world remembered Sneha only as the woman who disappeared, it felt to her family like a kind of erasure. Because she hadn't just disappeared. She had lived. Deeply. Messily. Fully. In time, friends who had shared her early life, high school classmates, college roommates, fellow medical students, reached out less often. Life moved forward. But many still marked her birthday quietly, in calendar reminders they never deleted. Some reread old emails. A few returned to the neighborhood near where she had last been seen, pausing in front of the building, looking up toward windows where she once lived, trying to piece together something from the air. But time, as it does, reshaped the edges of their grief. The sharpness dulled, but the weight remained. And in that softened space, Sneha continued to exist, not as a fading name, but as someone who had mattered. Every year, on the anniversary of the attacks, her name was spoken aloud during the memorial reading. Sometimes by strangers, sometimes by loved ones. The rhythm of that day had become familiar. Bells, silence, names. And when Sneha's name was called, it was not always met with recognition by the crowds watching. She had not worked at Cantor Fitzgerald or FDNY. She was not a passenger on any flight. But for those who knew, the name carried weight. It was a reminder that not every story fit cleanly into the larger narrative, that some losses defied structure, that even in a tragedy as vast as 9/11, there were moments, singular, personal, and deeply human, that were still unfolding. For Ron, each passing year brought a new shape to his grief. At first, it had been a fight, to be heard, to be believed, to prove what had felt self-evident. Later, it became something quieter, a kind of stewardship, to protect her memory, to remind people who she was. He still didn't have answers. He didn't know exactly where she had gone after that shopping trip. He didn't know what she had seen that morning. He didn't know if anyone had been with her in her final moments. But he knew her, and in the end, that knowledge remained the only certainty he had ever needed. Years passed. The skyline changed. The outlines of grief slowly gave way to steel and glass and green space. Where towers once stood, fountains now flowed, carved deep into the earth, reflecting the sky and the names of those lost. Among them, etched in bronze and touched by countless fingers, was the name Sneha Anne Philip. The water did not discriminate. It moved in gentle circles, the same over every name. There was no distinction made between those with witness accounts and those without. No deeper carving for those whose stories had clear timelines. The monument offered stillness, reflection, a reminder that memory does not require complete understanding to hold meaning. In that way, Sneha's name settled not as a question, but as a presence. She had never been a symbol, though many tried to make her one. She had never been a perfect narrative, easily told and wrapped with resolution. What she had been was real, complicated, warm, difficult, brilliant, human, and the legacy she left behind, the one untouched by courtrooms or headlines, rested not in how she died, but in the pieces of life she gave to others. In every patient she treated with care and patience, even on days when she was exhausted. In every moment she spoke out against something she believed was wrong, even when it cost her. In every quiet act of loyalty she gave to her friends and family. In every conversation she had where she let someone feel seen, even when she was struggling herself. The image of Sneha, for those who knew her, wasn't one defined by surveillance footage or newsprint. It was of someone leaning on a kitchen counter in soft light, talking late into the night. It was of her handwriting in a note left on the table, of her voice on a hurried voicemail, of her coat draped over a chair. It was in the way she remembered birthdays, in how she carried silence when others needed it, in the look she gave when she didn't believe you, but was too polite to say so. It was in the intimacy of ordinary things, things that vanished not on a global stage, but quietly in the lives she left behind. When strangers visit the 9/11 memorial and run their hands over the names, they don't know all the stories behind them. Some names ring familiar, others feel distant, but there's something powerful in standing before a list that is, above all else, human. It is a roll call not of martyrs or mysteries, but of people who were living, working, walking, planning, sleeping, shopping, when the world was suddenly interrupted. Sneha had not been scheduled to be at Ground Zero that morning, but it didn't matter. She was part of the moment. She was part of the loss, and she was finally part of the memory. The questions about her case may never fully close. The last hours of her life may remain unconfirmed, the timeline always slightly out of reach. But those who loved her never required certainty to remember her. The answers, while important, had never been what defined her life. She had been defined by the way she showed up, in conversation, in laughter, in argument, in loyalty, by the depth of her care, by the sharpness of her mind, and by the quiet bravery of moving through a world that asked more of her than it ever gave back. Ron moved forward, eventually, not past her, but with her. He remarried years later, built a new life, but he never erased her. She remained present in how he spoke, how he paused during certain dates, how he honored her privately. He didn't stop remembering. He He just stopped needing everyone else to remember the same way. Because the fight was no longer for proof. It was for peace. Sneha's story, like so many from that day, does not end with resolution. It ends with stillness, with a name gently spoken, with a space that no one else can fill, and with the quiet certainty that she was here, that she lived, and that she is remembered. May she rest in peace.